Hello and welcome to the Perfectly Brewed Show. I'm your host Rahul Trivedi, and this podcast is all about breaking down economic, political, and social events that influence and shape our society. So, in this episode, I'm going to give you the bird's eye view of how the budget is supposed to or expected to look like. And in the following episodes, I'll try to be more specific and explain each thing industry wise. But for this one, let's dive into the general view first. What I'm going to say might sound nerdy or complicated, but it is not. I'm going to use some common sense here. So for the upcoming budget, I'm expecting that government is going to be very mindful about specifically three indicators. The first is revenue deficit, the second is fiscal deficit, and the third is capital expenditure. So let me explain these three terminologies in a little bit of detail because these things are going to be very important in determining the post-COVID phase of Indian economy. So the first is revenue deficit. Revenue deficit is basically the mismatch in projected revenue receipts and revenue expenditure of the government. This mismatch can be in surplus or deficit depending upon how the government acts. Let me give you a very simple example. So if the government spends more than it earns, then revenue deficit will occur. And if the government earns more than it spends, then the excess will be called revenue surplus. However, the second scenario, the surplus scenario, is highly unlikely to play out considering the COVID situation. The second is fiscal deficit. The fiscal deficit is the difference between total expenditure and total income of the government, excluding the external borrowing. External borrowing is excluded because that's the whole point of fiscal deficit. It gives government the idea about how much it can borrow from the market. Please do not confuse fiscal deficit with revenue deficit. The main difference between two is when estimating revenue deficit, capital side of the budget is not taken into account and it only concerns the revenue side of the budget, which is revenue expense and revenue income. And the last terminology is capital expenditure, which goes into creating assets and infrastructure in the economy. For example, building roads, ports, bridges, schools, hospitals, etc. It is basically the money spent on the development of the economy. It is fiscally imprudent for government to borrow money for revenue expenditure because according to the research paper titled Fiscal Multipliers of India, when the government spends 100 rupees on increasing salaries or subsidies in India, the economy grows by little less than 100 rupees. But when the government uses that same money to create infrastructure in the economy's GDP grows by 250 rupees. And this is where the Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act comes into the picture. The FRBM Act of 2003 had mandated that apart from limiting the fiscal deficit to 3% of the nominal GDP, the revenue deficit should actually come down to 0%. So it basically meant that government should only borrow money for capital expenditure and it should earn enough money through tax and non-tax revenue to cover all of its revenue expenditure, which never actually happened. In the aftermath of 2008 financial crisis, several amendments were made to the FRBM Act to essentially delay the fiscal targets, and in 2018 NDA was heavily criticized for bringing down capital expenditure rather than revenue expenditure to meet the fiscal targets. So in simple words, government did not spend enough on things that actually create output in the economy and provide sustainable growth, and that is partly the reason India experienced sluggish growth in the last decade. But that was 2018 and there was no pandemic or nationwide lockdown at that point. And right now, government doesn't really have that liberty to bring down revenue deficit to literally 0%. That will be simply unachievable. And fiscal conservatism in times of crisis could actually backfire. There is a general consensus among economists that in order to stimulate crisis-ridden economy, government has to borrow or print if need be and spend, and there is no other way. And the spending has actually increased, but I would say marginally. The government has managed to keep its expenses in check despite announcing the multiple rounds of stimulus package to tackle the COVID-19 situation. The total expenditure in the first 7 months of the current financial year, which is from April to October 2020, registered a 0.4% increase compared to the same period last year. COVID-related uncertainty was probably the reason government was reluctant to spend in the first half of current financial year. So if the government expenditure is not increasing, what has pushed the fiscal deficit to go to 7.7% of the budget estimate of 3.5%? The culprit here is the overall lower tax collection due to the nationwide lockdown, which is, by the way, main source of government's revenue. That being said, fiscal deficit should actually come down next year by way of increasing total revenue without decreasing the spending, and the focus should be on capital expenditure, meaning creating infrastructure within the economy, which will eventually lead to the higher GDP growth, and higher GDP growth is expected to raise the tax revenue in the next financial year. So in conclusion, I would say that in the upcoming union budget, I am expecting that government will spend more money on capital expenditure and bring down revenue deficit by increasing its tax revenue and making its PSUs more efficient. I think it is fairly easy to point that out for the purpose of content creation, but in reality, it is an enormous task for the finance ministry, and this year's budget is going to have a historical significance in the Indian economics, and which is coming next month, by the way. So let's see what happens. This is only the beginning, and I'll be covering many more episodes once the budget comes out, and you can let me know in the comment if you have any specific questions. So this is it for today. Like, share and subscribe. Bye bye.